For days, there was one simple explanation for almost everything Kaydee did in Big Bear. Shadow moved, Kaydee followed, Shadow changed trees, Kaydee appeared nearby, Shadow took off. Sometimes, only seconds later, Kaydee was in the air behind him. It was easy to look at the pattern and say the same thing every time. She was following Shadow. But on the morning of August 24, something happened that made that explanation feel incomplete. Shadow and Kaydee began the day in the same general roosting area. The sun was rising over Big Bear Valley. The lake below them was beginning to catch the morning light. And for a while, the two eagles were exactly where viewers had become accustomed to finding them lately, near each other. Then Kaydee left. But this time, she did not simply wait for Shadow to show her where to go. She headed toward the nest. Alone, Shadow remained behind. And Kaydee, she went straight to work. That may sound like a small detail, but in the developing story between these two eagles, it may be one of the most interesting details yet, because Kaydee may have arrived in Big Bear because Shadow caught her attention. But now there are signs that something else may be catching her attention too. His territory, his familiar trees, and especially his nest. Only a short time ago, Kaydee was still the mysterious young eagle appearing around Big Bear Valley. She had bands on her legs, a mostly white head that still showed signs of her younger plumage, and an increasingly noticeable habit of appearing wherever Shadow seemed to be. The two were seen in the same roost tree. They exchanged morning vocalizations. They spent long stretches perched in the same areas, and on more than one occasion when Shadow departed, Kaydee followed almost immediately. On August 23, friends of Big Bear Valley even noted that when Shadow took off, Kaydee was only about 2 seconds behind him. It was enough to inspire the playful description. Shadow has a shadow, and for a while that seemed like the perfect summary. Kaydee was curious about him. She stayed close. She followed his movements. She seemed to be learning Big Bear by learning Shadow. But then something began changing. Kaydee started showing interest in places even when Shadow was not occupying them. Most importantly, the nest. The nest is not just another perch in Big Bear. It is one of the most significant locations in Shadow's life. For years, Shadow returned there with Jackie. They built there. They rearranged sticks there. They raised eaglets there. They defended it. They endured snowstorms in it. Season after season, the same structure became the center of their breeding territory. So when another eagle begins repeatedly entering that space, that matters. Not necessarily romantically, not yet, but behaviorally, it is difficult to ignore. And Kaydee does not simply land on the edge and leave. She investigates. She walks around. She pulls at branches. She rearranges nest material. She wrestles with sticks that seem almost too large for her. And increasingly, she behaves less like an eagle accidentally passing through, and more like an eagle becoming familiar with the place. The day before, viewers had already watched one of the most fascinating interactions yet between Shadow and Kaydee. Kaydee arrived at the nest and immediately began working on the sticks. Shadow was nearby. At first, he mostly watched. Kaydee pulled, lifted, twisted, repositioned. Some branches moved easily, others became battles, and still she continued. Eventually, Shadow stepped back into the nest. For a short time, both eagles were working among the same branches, not perfectly together, not like a seasoned pair, but together nonetheless. Then came the negotiations. Their beaks met. Kaydee attempted closer contact. She nibbled near Shadow's feathers and beak. Shadow was not completely receptive. He moved away. He created distance. His message seemed clear. Too close. Not yet. But then came the important part. Shadow came back. That pattern deserves attention. Not because it proves romance. It does not. Not because one shared stick proves a pair bond. It certainly does not. But because their interactions are becoming more complicated than simple acceptance or rejection. Kaydee approaches. Shadow sometimes creates distance. Kaydee remains. Shadow returns. They share space again. Then another interaction begins. That is not a finished relationship. It is a relationship being negotiated. Two eagles learning each other's boundaries. Kaydee seems bold. Shadow seems more cautious. Kaydee often closes the distance. Shadow decides how much distance he will tolerate, and then they meet again. That last part may be the most important. Then came the morning of August 24. Shadow and Kaydee were once again seen near each other in the roosting area. Another morning together, another familiar beginning, but Kaydee soon departed. And instead of simply waiting to see where Shadow would go, she headed toward the nest. Shadow did not lead her there, he did not need to. Kaydee already knew the way. She landed. And once again, the sticks became her business. There was even a tiny feather caught near one of her nostrils, creating a slightly comical look for an eagle otherwise approaching her task with complete seriousness. But Kaydee seemed unbothered. She began rearranging nest material again, pulling, inspecting, moving, working, without Shadow standing beside her. That changes the question until now. Viewers could reasonably wonder, is Kaydee interested in this nest, or is she simply interested in Shadow? But when an eagle independently returns to a location and begins interacting with the structure while the other eagle remains elsewhere, the distinction becomes more interesting. Kaydee was not just occupying Shadow as Shadow anymore. For a little while, she was doing her own thing in his nest, and that may be an important step in understanding what Big Bear is becoming to her. Because if Kaydee were only following Shadow from perch to perch, the story would remain relatively simple. A young eagle finds an older eagle interesting. She follows him. She learns the territory. Eventually, she moves on, possible. But repeated interest in the nest itself creates another possibility. Maybe Kaydee is not just learning Shadow. Maybe she is learning his world. And yet, after spending time at the nest, Kaydee did something equally interesting. She went back towards Shadow. She joined him on another tree limb. Think about the sequence. They begin the morning near each other. Kaydee leaves Shadow. She goes to the nest independently. She interacts with it. Then she returns to the area where Shadow is perched. That is different from simply chasing him everywhere he goes. For at least part of that morning, Kaydee made her own choice. Shadow stayed in one place. Kaydee went somewhere else. And then she chose proximity again. Maybe that is coincidence. Maybe it is simply normal movement within an attractive habitat. We cannot ask her, but when the same two eagles repeatedly separate and repeatedly end up near each other again, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss as a single isolated moment. This is where the story between Shadow and Kaydee becomes much more interesting than a dramatic will they or won they. Because pair formation in wild eagles is not decided by one beautiful scene. It is not decided by one beak touch. It is not decided because humans think two birds look good together. Real relationships in wild animals are built from behavior, repeated presence, tolerance, territory, communication, timing, and eventually, if things continue developing, courtship and nesting behavior. Late August is still early. Friends of Big Bear Valley considers September 1 the beginning of the nesting season calendar they follow, and much stronger clues would be expected later as fall and winter progress. Kaydee and Shadow have not been officially declared a bonded pair. Popular science, so the question is not, are Shadow and Kaydee officially together? They are not. The better question is, are they beginning to build a pattern together? And that answer is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Consider what has happened across recent days. They have roosted in the same tree. They have vocalized around sunrise. They have occupied nearby branches for long periods. Kaydee has followed Shadow quickly after takeoff. She has repeatedly entered the nest. They have both manipulated nest material. Kaydee has attempted close physical contact. Shadow has sometimes rejected that closeness, but he has continued allowing her around the territory. And after disagreements, they have continued appearing near each other. That is the part that separates this story from one dramatic viral clip. No single moment matters as much as repetition. One visit can mean almost anything. Repeated visits begin to form a pattern. One morning together can be coincidence. Many mornings become familiarity. One nest visit may be curiosity. Returning again and again, that becomes something worth watching. And perhaps that is why August 24 felt subtly different. There was no huge romantic breakthrough, no dramatic food delivery, no obvious courtship display, no moment where Shadow suddenly welcomed Kaydee into the nest like a longtime partner. Instead, Kaydee did something quieter. She went there without him. And sometimes the quiet behavioral changes tell us more than the dramatic ones, because Kaydee did not need Shadow physically standing in the nest for the nest to hold her attention. She already remembered it, she already knew it, she already seemed comfortable landing there, and after working alone, she returned to Shadow. Two attractions may now be overlapping: the place and the eagle associated with it. Imagine this from Shadow's side, not by pretending we know what he thinks, but by looking only at what he does. A younger eagle is using trees inside his familiar territory. She is appearing beside him. She is following him. She is entering his nest. She is moving his sticks. She has approached closely enough to nibble at his feathers, and Shadow has absolutely shown limits. He has stepped away. He has reacted. He has made space when Kaydee pushed too far. That is important. It tells us this is not some effortless instant partnership, but what Shadow has not consistently done may be just as interesting. He has not completely removed himself from Kaydee's presence. He has not ended every interaction permanently. He continues showing up in the same places. He has shared the nest with her. He has returned after moving away. He has worked on sticks while she was there, and on the morning Kaydee independently worked at the nest. She later joined him elsewhere. Their distance changes. Their connection does not disappear. Maybe the best word for this stage is not romance. Maybe it is familiarity. That can sound less exciting, but in nature, familiarity may be exactly where bigger things begin. Before two animals can coordinate successfully, they need to tolerate one another. Before they can share breeding space, they need to become comfortable, occupying the same territory. Before synchronized nest work becomes meaningful, they need to repeatedly return to the same nest. The extraordinary moment may not be when two eagles touch beaks. It may be when one eagle starts treating the other's familiar world as part of her own routine. That is the reframe. Kaydee's biggest step may not have been getting closer to Shadow. It may have been becoming comfortable enough to move away from him and still come back. There is another reason this matters emotionally. For viewers, the nest carries memories. Jackie lived there. Jackie and Shadow built there. Every stick seems connected to years of history, so seeing Kaydee move those branches can be difficult. For some people, it feels too soon. For others, it brings hope. Both reactions make sense, but Kaydee is not erasing anything. Wildlife does not erase its history when circumstances change. The old story remains true, and a new story can still begin. Kaydee does not need to become another Jackie. She cannot. She is a different eagle. Different age, different personality, different behavioral rhythm. If she becomes important to Shadow's future, it will happen because of who she is, not because she recreates what came before. And perhaps that is what makes watching these interactions so compelling. They are imperfect. Kaydee sometimes seems almost too bold. Shadow sometimes appears reluctant. They disagree over space. They disagree over sticks. They do not behave like an established pair. Because they are not one, at least not yet. What they do look like is two eagles trying to understand where the other fits. Kaydee pushes closer. Shadow sets a boundary. Kaydee returns. Shadow remains. Kaydee enters the nest. Shadow joins later. Kaydee leaves him to work independently, then returns to his side. It is almost a conversation without words. Not a romantic conversation. A behavioral one. How close can I stand? Can I use this branch? Can I enter this nest? Can I move this stick? Will you stay if I come closer? Will you return if I move away? Wild eagles answer those questions through movement. And lately, Shadow and Kaydee have been answering each other repeatedly. That makes the next step especially important. For most of this developing relationship, Kaydee has been the more obvious initiator. She follows, she approaches, she enters, she explores, she touches, Shadow reacts. But what happens if that begins to reverse? That is the behavior I would watch now. What happens when Kaydee leaves first? Does Shadow follow? What happens when Kaydee reaches the nest alone? Does Shadow arrive later? What happens if Kaydee chooses a perch away from him? Does Shadow close the distance? What happens when she does not initiate physical contact? Does he? Those would be meaningful changes. Because right now the story is largely, Kaydee keeps choosing Shadow. The next chapter could begin when viewers can confidently say, Shadow is starting to choose Kaydee too. And that does not need to happen tomorrow. There is time. Fall has barely begun approaching Big Bear. The stronger nesting season is still ahead. Weather will change, behavior will change, other eagles may appear, Kaydee herself may continue exploring. Nothing about her future in Big Bear is guaranteed. That uncertainty is what makes every morning worth watching. Because she could leave, or she could keep returning. Tomorrow, next week, into September, into fall, into winter, and if she keeps coming back to the same lake, the same trees, the same nest, and the same eagle, eventually the word visitor may begin to feel less accurate. Maybe that is what August 24 quietly showed us. Kaydee did not need Shadow to bring her home. She already knew where the nest was. She went there herself, she worked there herself, she stayed there without him, and then, when she was finished, she went back to his side. Not because we know she loves him, not because we can know what is inside an eagle's mind, but because that is what the cameras showed. Separation, independence, and then proximity again. And perhaps those three things together tell a more interesting story than simply watching Kaydee follow Shadow by 2 seconds. She may be becoming comfortable enough to have her own routine in Big Bear. A routine that still keeps intersecting with his. The nest may be the key. For Shadow, it represents years of life. For Kaydee, it is something new. For viewers, it sits between memory and possibility. And over the coming weeks, it may reveal where this relationship is going before anything else does. Will Kaydee keep arriving there alone? Will Shadow begin arriving after her? Will they work on branches together more often? Will their disagreements decrease? Will Shadow tolerate closer contact? Will their morning calls become more consistent? Will they begin moving through the territory less like one eagle following another, and more like two eagles choosing the same places together? Those are the clues that matter now. Not one kiss, not one argument, not one branch, a pattern. For now, Kaydee remains free to explore. Shadow remains free to decide how much of his world he is willing to share. Nature has made no promises, but something subtle has changed. Kaydee once seemed like an eagle following Shadow through Big Bear. Now she is beginning to look like an eagle who knows where she wants to go, even when Shadow is not leading the way. And strangely, that may bring her closer to him than following ever could, because maybe a real connection does not begin when one individual follows the other everywhere. Maybe it begins when both can move independently and still keep choosing to come back to the same place, the same tree, the same nest, the same morning, and perhaps the same eagle, so the next time Kaydee leaves Shadow behind and flies toward that nest. Watch carefully. The bigger question may no longer be whether she will follow him. It may be whether, one day, Shadow follows her.